Wow, she could have talked more. That was so nice. Thank you. She's so sweet. She's been so accommodating, so willing to help. And I want to thank the committee and everyone for everything, inviting Keith and I. Hi, I'm Sue.
Hi, Sue.
And I'm a very grateful member of the ALANON family group because today I love an alcoholic. And I like to say that because I didn't when I got here. And so anyway, and I want to thank Don and Tamara. I want to have him with the right woman for lunch today. He makes a great stew, and she has the pear cobbler, and wow. Anyway, a lot of work for a lot of people. Thank you. And the committee's done a lot of work on this thing, you can tell. And this afternoon we got back from lunch. There was a whole band of young people coming up. And he said, great, they're bringing the young people in for the young AA speaker. And this guy was saying, okay, you guys, now listen. He's talking to young alcoholics, right? He goes, don't wander around, don't do this, don't do that, you know. And then he said, and act like a grown-up. And I thought, well, that blows that. None of us act like a grown-up. And Keith was going to sit up here in front, but he didn't want to sit by himself. But there's some people sitting on the second row over here. That's great, you know. I wondered, who's coming? You know, who are we waiting on? So, anyway, that was just on my mind. I had to get rid of that. And, you know, we have a lot of fun today because I'm the kind of Al-Anon that was... we didn't have a whole lot of Al-Anon literature when I got this program. My recovery date's May the 11th, 1976. We didn't have a lot of literature then. And so I was taken through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm so grateful. And if you're new here in Al-Anon, you haven't read that book, I strongly suggest that you do, because our program says to... learn everything you can about the disease of alcoholism, and I don't know a better book than the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's so many things that, as a non-alcoholic, I needed to learn out of that book. And one of the things I got to realize is that we're not a glum lot. Well, there are a lot of tragedies in our life. There's a lot of bad things that we go through. But once we start going through the steps and looking at ourselves, we can learn to laugh at the things we used to cry about. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of inventory work to do that. But I am so grateful I got to that point in my life. And it was through strong sponsorship that I got there. And I am a believer in strong sponsorship. Like he shared this morning, the 3 most important words in our house is call your sponsor. Still, 37 and a half years ago. We said it, and we can say it today if we need to. A lot of water went under the bridge before I ever knew about Al-Anon. And I wasn't raised in an alcoholic home. My family, I had an older sister, a younger brother. My dad worked in the oil fields, and we used to follow the oil rigs around all over Kansas and Oklahoma and the Texas-Oklahoma Panhandle and western Kansas. And we lived in a trailer house, and we hauled that trailer out to all these towns where they were drilling. And we were called oil field trash a lot. And so there was something in me before I ever was introduced to the disease of alcoholism that I had self-esteem issues. And I worked on those kind of things, but it's like I never felt like I belonged anywhere. And I never felt like anyone liked me, you know, and all that stuff. I'd go to 7 schools in 1 year, and then we'd move up. So, you know, no wonder I never felt like I belonged. And we moved to a little town in the Texas Panhandle, and we stayed there. My family bought a house there, and we stayed there. My dad... he died of colon cancer at 40 years old. Back then, they didn't have all of the treatment for it they did. My older sister, had run off and got married, and that left my younger brother and I at home with my mom. And a few years after my dad passed away, well, it wasn't even that long, my mom started dating. And I really hated her for that because she's being disloyal to my father. And so I started looking for love in all the wrong places. And I ended up in an unwedded mother's home in San Antonio, Texas. And I stayed there for a period of time, and I gave a child up for adoption. And so when I went back home, I didn't like the kids that I'd ran with. I had matured through all of that. And so one day my mom said, "You want to go to a honky-tonk with me and my friends?" And I said, "Sure." And so we go to this Quonset building, and the music was loud, and it was smoky on the inside. People were fighting, and they were dancing, and it's like they were drinking out of paper sacks, and it's like, yeah. I mean, I loved everything about it. It was exciting for me. And I watched the room, and this cowboy, he started fights all over the room, and I thought it took a lot of courage to do what he was doing. And he started this fight, and he came running past me, and he said, "Honey, let me know when the fight's over." And he hid in the woman's restroom. And when the fight was over, I said, "Cowboy, you can come out now." And he asked me for the last dance. And usually the last dance was a slow dance where you could rub up against each other and get ready to go home. I know you guys have done that in New Mexico. And and it was a fast dance. And it kept getting faster and faster and faster. And we never missed a lick. And when I look back on that, what I understand today is that he got me downtown in the fast lane right now. And I loved it. And he called me the next day for a date. My mom said, "No, you're not going with him. He's older than you. He's been married before, and he's in trouble all the time." And so the doorbell rang, and I opened the door, and there's Keith. And I said, "Okay, let's go." And I got my purse, started walking out, and there was no car. I go, "Wait a minute, my dates pick me up in cars." He said, "Well, you don't understand." He said, "I've lost my driver's license forever, and I totaled my car." And I said, "No problem." And I knew what to do. I got him in my car, and I went to the drive-in movie. Some of you have never heard of that before, but they had drive-in movies. And I knew what to do there. You sit there and you kiss and smooch. And we sat there and we watched the movie. And I remember thinking, this must be what it's like to be with a more mature man. And then I noticed that he had a six-pack of beer sitting between his legs that he was more interested in than me. And that set up that obsession in me. I wanted to be number one in that man's life. And that obsession nearly killed me for the next 15 years. And we started dating. And, he'd come over on Wednesday nights, and he'd fall asleep watching TV with me. My girlfriends were saying that their boyfriends would come over at their house during the week, and they'd sit and watch TV, and they'd kiss and smooch on the couch, And my boyfriend was coming over, and he was falling asleep. I didn't understand pass out. And the arrogance in me is that I'll show you. The sweet taste of revenge. That carried me through the next 15 years. I'll show you. And so I looked at him, and at that time, Keith had long hair and a long beard, and I went and got a razor. And I shaved half his head and half his face off. And he got up and he went home. And he came back the next night to take me out, and he still looked the same. And we would go drag Main Street. We'd go down this side. He'd be all clean shaven and everything. We'd go back, and on this side, he'd have long hair, long beard. And people would say, "Well, everybody in this town thinks I'm two-faced anyway." And he looked like that for 2 weeks. He went like that. And I thought he was so funny. He is funny, a few years ago when he started, he had a lot of hair, and when he started getting bald on the top and then going down, receding, I went home from a meeting one night, and he said, he was in the bathroom shaving his head off, and I said, "Oh my gosh." He said, we're not going to have one of those hair fights again, because I used to complain about his hair being too long all the time. And I said, no, I don't guess so. You don't have any anymore. He said, why didn't you tell me? And I said, tell you what? He said, I looked at the back of my head with a mirror, and it looked like I had a toilet seat sitting on my head. And he's funny like that, you know. It's just, and I had to learn after I got in Al-Anon how funny he was, because I always thought it was embarrassing, you know, because you just don't do some of the things he did. And so he got a draft notice, and we dated for 2 weeks. And when he wouldn't do what I wanted him to, like we'd go park to smooch and stuff, and he wouldn't be paying that much attention to me and doing what I wanted him to do, I'd jerk the keys out of the car and I'd throw them out in the vacant lot. And he'd have to go out and get them, and he'd have to look for them. And he'd get back in the car and he'd be angry. He'd be mad as hell at me. And I'd start whacking him and saying, you can't talk to me like that. And I'd sock him, and he'd sock me back, and we'd have a big fight in the car. And he'd take me home, and I'd walk in the door, and I'd have a black eye. And my mom would say, what do you do to that man to make him treat you like that? And I'd say, look what he did to me. Just look what he did. I could never look at my part, you know, because we always want to blame something on everybody else. It's never my fault. If they wouldn't, if he wouldn't. And it was like, that was my song for the next 15 years. He got a draft notice, and we decided we couldn't live without each other, so we went to Amarillo to get married. And then the next weekend he took his draft physical, and Uncle Sam didn't want him, so I got to keep him. And he'd been to school for many years, but he'd never stayed long enough anywhere to get a degree. And so his grandparents and I talked about it, and we decided that I had what it took to make him stay put. And so we moved to Stillwater, Oklahoma for Keith to enroll in school. And a few weeks after we got there, our daughter Simone was born. And I remember when they handed me that little girl thinking, thank God she's a girl. Because Keith was a drunk, his dad was a drunk, and his granddad was a town drunk. I didn't know that alcoholism doesn't care what sex, color, race, or creed you are. It takes you to the gates of insanity and hell, and you don't even have to drink booze to get there. And so he finally got his degree. He took him 4 years to get a 2-year degree. And I took all the credit, because by then the alcoholism in him was telling the alcoholism in me that I was nobody, that I didn't count, and that I wasn't worth anything. And we'd go to those places, those dances there in Stillwater, and he'd say, I'd tell him, don't fight. Don't fight when you're here tonight. And he'd say, I won't. I promise I won't. And so we go to those dances, and I'd take him and I'd sit him in a booth. I'd have to go to the ladies' room, and I'd take him over and sit him in a booth, and I'd go, stay. And I'd go to the restroom, and I'd come back, and there's a big fight in the middle of the dance floor. And it's like, damn him. He can't mind. And so I'd push my way through all of those guys, and somebody would sock me, and I'd fall on the floor, and they'd look down, where in the heck did she come from? And they'd pull me up, and I'd look over, and Keith was still in the booth. It's like you can never predict what an alcoholic's going to do or when they're going to do it. Sometimes they will mind, but you're not ready for it. So we lived like that, and we'd have fights over just silly things like that. And so when he got his degree, he was offered a job out in California and came home and said, I want to move to California. And I said, no, I'm not going to go there. It's too wild and crazy out there. We'll never raise children in California. He said, babe, you don't understand. He said, you go to California and you go to a restaurant, go out to eat dinner, and they serve you cocktails. He said, you don't ever have to get in a fight with anybody again. You don't have to drink out of a paper sack anymore. And a lady like you belongs out there. And I'm going, yeah. Oh, God. We're so gullible. And so we get all of our stuff ready, and he builds this big old box, puts it on wheels, sprays it bright blue, hooks it on the back of our station wagon, and we head for California. And we looked like the greats of wrath going out there. We had laid the back down, and Simone was in the back, and our German Shepherd dog and our cat was back there. And it should take 3 days to get there. It took us 30. Because he had to stop at a friend of his in Oklahoma City to get a prescription filled in a baggie before we went. So it depended on how much he drank and what he took as to how far we went. And there was days that we just stayed put. And we'd wake up in the mornings, and I'd look at Keith to know how I was supposed to feel and how Simone's supposed to act. Because if it's not working for Daddy, we're in trouble. And we knew that. We knew that. And it got so crazy in that car. The German Shepherd would stand behind the driver's seat, and when big trucks would go by, he'd run back to the back of the station wagon, hit his head on the window, barking and stuff, and then he'd fall down, get on top of the cat, and they'd be having a dog and cat fight, and they'd be on top of Simone, and she'd be crying and screaming. I'd turn around, start whacking and bitching, and Keith would start drinking. And we did that one day at a time for 30 days. And so we finally got to California, and it's going to be different here. And he went to work, and I would stand and watch for him to come home. I'd stand at the window and watch for him to come home because I never knew when he was going to be home. And it was going to be wonderful. One Friday night he came home and he said, "Babe, would you like to go out for dinner?" And I said, "Yeah." Because you see, that's what I wanted to do. It's going to be different in California. We can act like a lady and a gentleman and be normal people and just drink cocktails because you get drunk when you drink out of paper sacks. And so we'd go to the restaurant, and they seated us and they asked us if we'd like a cocktail, and we said, "Yeah, you bet." And we ordered Simone a Shirley Temple because we didn't want to leave her out of the good life. And Keith held his glass up, and we toasted to the good life. And it was wonderful. It was everything I dreamt that it was supposed to be, that you see in the movies and all that stuff. And they'd bring him another drink and bring him another drink, and he had 10 drinks to my one. I knew exactly how many. I counted every one of them. And so finally they came over and asked us if we wanted to take our order, and they said, and I'd watched these people in there, and they had these tall crystal glasses with stems on them. Now, growing up in the trailer house, you don't have china and crystal and stuff like that. And I'd watch them, they'd swish it and they'd smell it, and I didn't know what they were doing, but I wanted to be like them, and that's what you got to do to be normal. And so I'd watch them do that, and it's like I was always judging my insides with everybody's outsides. If I could just feel the way you looked would be okay. And so he asked us if we wanted wine with our dinner, and I said, sure. And so he went and got the glasses, and he came back, and he poured just a little bit in Keith's glass and asked him to taste it to see if it was okay. I go, wait a minute, what do you mean is it okay? He drank stuff in Oklahoma that had things floating in it. Pour mine. And they poured mine. And I sat there, and I swished it, and I sniffed it. Oh, my gosh. I was in heaven. I was somebody. Until I look across the table at Keith, and he's drinking out of the carafe. And I holler at him, what are you doing? What are you doing? And he looks at me like I don't know. He said, I'm drinking. What do you think I'm doing? And Simone slid under the table and said, not here. And I saw the waiter, and I yell at him, come here, come here. And I'm just screaming. And the waiter comes over to the table, and I don't ever want to forget this. He points right at me, and he said, I'm sorry, but you're not eating here. And I said, and why not? He said, because you don't know how to act. I went, oh my gosh. And we're walking out, and Keith's giving everybody, he's talking to everybody in sign language. We could never go back. And it's like, what happened? What happened? You know? And we get home, and I get right in his face. You ever do that to us again? Don't ever treat us like that. And he'd say, Sue, get out of my face. And I'd take one step closer, and if you do this, and if you do that, and he'd say, Sue, if you don't get out of my face, I'm going to hit you. And I'd take one step closer, and he'd hit me, and the knockdown drag-out was on. And he had me on the bed one night, and he was choking the living tar out of me. And I thought, oh, my God, I'm going to die right here. And I looked up at Keith, and he's looking down at me with all the intensity he has. And it dawned on me he wasn't thinking about nobody but me. I was number one in his life. And I started those fights all the time after that because that's the only way I could get 100% of his attention. That's called insanity. That's how the disease affected me. And I'm obsessed with the alcoholic, and I think I can fix it. I think I can make it different. If I could just figure out what it is that'll make it work, it'll be okay. And we had those kind of fights all the time. And they were horrible. And he'd get tired of fighting with me, and he'd walk away, and I'd have that rage inside of me. And I'd turn around. I didn't know what to do with it. Simone would be standing there, and I'd start banging her head against the wall and just screaming. And she'd look at me, and she'd say, Mommy, I know why you're doing this. You're just showing Daddy you can act just like him. And I thought, oh, my gosh, how does she know? I didn't know that. You know, and it's just we'd have those fights like that all the time. You know, it runs downhill. Our children are so affected by our disease, and we think they don't understand. I mean, you know, I sponsor so many women that the simplest things are catastrophes. Everything is an explosion. There's no little deals going on. So, you know, our disease progressed. We had those fights one night. We had a fight, and Keith left, and he didn't come home. Now, you don't do that to me. And Keith and I, you know, when we fought, he was from Texas, and he had a gun all the time, and he'd shoot things that I didn't want him to shoot, you know, like the light fixtures or the walls or pets. You know, it didn't really matter to him. And because he was drunk, and I understand blackouts today. And I was going to show him, you can't treat me like that. And so I picked up a knife, and I started fighting back with that knife. And he'd stick his gun right on the end of my nose. He'd say, "See, if you don't shut up, I'm going to shoot you." And I'd stick my knife right in his stomach, and I'd say, "You go first." He goes, "What do you mean if I go first? If I shoot you, you're dead." And I said, "I know, but when the bullet hits me, it'll knock me backwards. The momentum will make the knife go forwards, and we'll both die at the same time, so go for it." And he'd look at me, and he'd go, "You're crazy." And I was. And we had a fight one night, and he didn't come home like he was supposed to, and like he usually did. And that made me so angry. And I didn't know what to do, and I cried. I cried, God, please, let him get hurt out there. You know, let him get killed in a car wreck or something, but don't let anybody else get hurt. And then I think, what am I saying? What am I thinking? My gosh, this is the man I'm supposed to love, and I'm wishing him dead. What's wrong with me? And I cried myself to sleep. Next morning, I got up, and he still wasn't home. And it's like, okay, he's not going to do this to us. We're going to go find him. And I went and got Simone up, and I said, come on, we're going to go find your dad. And I didn't have a clue in California where to find him, like looking for a needle in a haystack. But I thought, well, I'll look at this place, after hours place that we used to go to down in Orange, and it was about 12, 14 miles from our house. And I thought, I start out down there. And so I started down there, and I was a few blocks from that place, and I looked over, and I saw Keith's pickup over by this house, and this house had motorcycles all over the lawn. By then, Keith had become a Hell's Angel, and I hated that part the most. And I thought, I'll show him. And I took the keys out of my purse, and I drove that pickup 2 blocks from that house. Then I walked back to my car, and I drove my car 2 blocks in front of that pickup. Then I walked back to the pickup, and I drove my car 2 blocks in front, and I drove the pickup. It only took me 4 hours to get both of those vehicles home, but I did it, and I felt good. And I was a good mother. I never left Simone unattended in either one of those vehicles. She walked every step of the way with me. And pretty soon Keith calls, and I answer, and he said, I said, what do you want? And he said, Sue, please help me. Please come and get me and bring me home. I said, no, you're in there with all your buds. You know, you have somebody in there bring you home. He goes, buds. I said, yeah, you're over there at that house. And he goes, what house? I don't know what you're talking about. He said, I'm in jail. I go, jail? You can't go to jail unless we're having a fight at our house and the cops come because the neighbors called him, I called him, or Simone called him. You just don't go out there and go to jail by yourself. Do you understand me? And he was going, whatever, Sue. Because I had Keith arrested all the time. And I'd write hot checks to bail him out. And I got in trouble for hot checks. So I said, okay. So Simone and I went down to jail. And, and I'd gone and seen him before when he was in jail, and I'd look at him through that glass thing, and I'd say, do you know where you're at? Like, duh. But it's like, I went down this time, and I paid his bail. And we left. And Simone said, Mommy, let's get Daddy. Don't leave Daddy. And I said, your daddy is a no-good, rotten son of a gun. He doesn't love you or he doesn't love me, or he wouldn't act this way. You see, I thought that everything he did was tied to love. I did not know that alcoholism is an illness, that it's a disease, and that we all had it. It's why our house was so chaos and why it was so crazy and why there was so much violence all the time. I didn't know that. And putting him down to his own daughter. And so we're home for a while, and pretty soon the doorbell rings, and I go to the door, and there's Keith. And I go, what do you want? And I had the door locked. He said, Sue, let me in. I said, no, you can't come in. He said, Sue, please let me in. I said, if you want in, you get on your knees and you beg. You beg. And that man got on his knees and begged to get back into his own home, robbing that man of his dignity. And I unlocked the door, he did that, and I unlocked the door, and he came in and he said, oh, and by the way, honey, thank you for bringing my pickup home. And I wanted to die. I wanted to just die. I didn't do that to be nice. You could never outsmart an alcoholic. Yeah, it's so funny. And we lived like that way for years. And we had a fight one night. And when Keith had come home and passed out on me, I'd have my butcher knife with me. And he'd pass out on his, go in the bed, just fall on the bed. And this one night he was in there, and I wasn't through talking to him. You don't pass out on me 10 minutes into a 2-hour conversation. And he passed out on me, and I took my knife and I just started stabbing him all over his back. And when his back started bleeding, I thought, oh my gosh, what am I doing? This is a man I'm supposed to love, and I'm trying to kill him. And I thought, oh my gosh, and I laid down and I cried myself to sleep one more time because something's wrong with me. I don't know what it is. Because I don't drink, I don't get drunk. And Keith woke up the next morning and he goes, oh my gosh, Sue, something's wrong with my back. And I said, well, let me see. And he turned around and I said, you've broken out with acne of the back. You've been drinking all that rot gut whiskey. But just a second, baby, I'll go get the bourbon alcohol and I'll fix it. No, I love that. I was always leaving him. I was always divorcing him. And this one night, I fell down and I got the whole side of my face kicked in. And the next day, I went to work and made up all kinds of stories about what had happened and stuff. And there was an attorney across the hall that I'd been to him before. I went over him and I walked in and he said, oh my gosh, Sue, what happened to you? And I said, Keith and I had a fight. He said, do you fight like this all the time? And I said, no, only when he drinks. He said, do you think he's an alcoholic? And I said, I don't know what that is. He said, well, it's somebody that can't quit drinking. And I said, he must be one, because I threw out booze and filled bottles up with water, and he got drunk on water a lot. And the man said, if you really love him, which was my answer, love fixes everything. he said, if you really love him, you'll take him to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I said, what is that? And he said, that's a place where people go to stop drinking. And I said, great. And I walked out of there because I had an answer. That's all I ever wanted was an answer. And so I go home, and Keith comes home, and he's laying on the couch, and I tell him I went to our attorney again. And he said, well, and I said, he told me that if I loved you, I would take you to this thing called Alcoholics Anonymous. And he looked at me with all the sincerity he had, and he said, babe, I thought it would come to this. So I called a man in AA today, and he showed me where there's a meeting in this church just right down the street, a few blocks from here. And he said, he told me there's a meeting there tonight. And I said, what time? He said, 8:30. See, I thought that he wanted to sober up because he loved us. I didn't know he'd been to court that day and was on a court card. And he was sentenced to Alcoholics Anonymous. I wanted to think that he loved us enough that he could stop drinking. And I'm so grateful today. I know that love has nothing to do with it. And so I kept watching. I asked him what time it started. He said 8:30. I kept watching the clock, and at 8:30 I went and got my knife, and I went over and jabbed him. And I said, get up. He said, what for? I said, that Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. He said, I don't think I want to go. And I jabbed him again. And I said, I think you do. And he got up, and we put the dog and the cat and Simone in the car, and we take Dad to AA. And we drive up in the front of this church, and they had an AA sign out there. I said, what time's this meeting over? And he said, 10. I said, I'll tell you what, dude, you come out of that door for 10 o'clock, I'll gut you. Now, when I got to Al-Anon, they said you couldn't keep an alcoholic sober, but I did for 4 months, taking him to that meeting, sitting in the parking lot with my butcher knife. The sad part about that is there was an Al-Anon meeting at that church, the exact same time. But you see, I hadn't gotten to the want to. I know that this program is for people who want it, not for people who need it. You see, I needed recovery then just as much as anybody in our house did, as much as Keith did. But you see, if he'd quit drinking, I'll be fine. And so I didn't go. And I let him go by himself, and he got drunk immediately. And I didn't, nothing works. Nothing works. And I had to get to the point that I had to hit a bottom. And I believe that every non-alcoholic has to hit a bottom, just like every alcoholic. And we was having a fight one night, and he turned on Simone, and he was doing the things to Simone that I always did to her. And I looked at him, and I thought, oh my gosh, he's not even a good father anymore. I have no excuses left. And I looked at Keith, and very calmly, I didn't grab my knife, I didn't do anything. I just said, I don't love you anymore, Keith, but I don't hate you either. And if you got to become a skid row bum, because I thought that's what happened to drunks, and that's what you got to do, but we ain't going any further with you. And Simone and I got some stuff when we got out of that house, and we were gone for 4 days. I don't have a clue what happened during those 4 days. But Simone needed some things for school, and she begged me to go back home. And we went back home, and it was dark in the house, and we were scared to death what was going to happen, because like I said, Keith was always shooting things, and he was always going to commit suicide. And so we didn't know what to expect, and so we looked all around the house, and we found him face down on the bedroom floor, and we thought he was dead, so we kicked him. And he turned over, and he looked at me, and he said, Sue, please help. And I know this is when God moved into my life. He gave me the most important word I could ever say to that man. The thing that helped him more than anything I could ever do. I looked at him, and I said, no, I can't help you. If you want help, you got to help yourself. There had to be a God, because I couldn't have done that. And he got up, and he went to the phone, and he called AA. Pretty soon, the doorbell rang. We had to fight with a gun and a knife again, the very last time. When the doorbell rang, I went to the door, and there's a little gray-headed, shriveled-up man standing there, and I thought, oh, geez, why don't they send the big ones on these trips? And little Jack Callahan walked into our house, and he made a 12-step call on a family. He said, I've seen Keith in AA before, but something's happened to him, and I think he wants it And he said, let's take him to a detox. And he took him to a few places, and he'd say, I can't get him in here. And I said, you got to find somewhere because you ain't taking him home. He's yours. You came and got him, and you're going to keep him. And he finally called the hospital where Dr. Paul worked, and they took him in. And Jack took me home, and he sat in the driveway with me, and he said, I know Keith, he acts like he wants AA this time, and he wants help. But he'll never make it coming home to an old idea, and you're an old idea. He said, you're going to have to go to a program called ALANON. And he told me, I said, no, if he quits drinking, I'll be fine. He said, no, you won't. He said, you're the craziest, most foul-mouthed woman I've ever heard. He said, you need a program. And he said, let's go in the house. Simone's worried about her daddy. We went in there, and he said, if you love your daddy, you'll go to a program called ALANON. And so Simone and I started going to Keith. While Keith was in the detox, we started going to our meetings. And I remember the first Al-Anon meeting I walked into. At that time, our big book had Living with an Alcoholic on the cover of it. And I went, whew. It was the first time in a long time I felt like I could breathe. I didn't have to make up any excuses. I didn't have to feel embarrassed. I could tell I didn't have to lie. And I felt comfortable. And all those women that were sharing were answering all my questions before I ever asked them. And I knew I'd found my home. And Keith came home after that, and he said, everybody's got to go program. And I said, we're going. And because I had, off and on, I drank and used with Keith. I never drank and used like he did because I'm not a drunk. I don't have the phenomena of craving. And so I don't have to drink, or I can have one drink and not have any more. And so they had a speaker meeting in there every Friday night at that hospital. And so they invited the families to go. And I heard this one speaker say, if you think you're an alcoholic, try having one drink every night for 30 days and see if that's all you have. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to try that. And so I'd go home and I'd drink. I'd get on the couch and I'd turn on the TV and I'd, open a can of beer and I'd sit there and watch TV and I'd fall asleep and I'd wake up in the morning and the can of beer would still be there. And I think, oh my gosh, how am I going to find out if I'm an alcoholic if I don't drink that? So I thought the next night I'm going to try a glass of wine. And the same thing happened the next night. And it dawned on me that I'm not an alcoholic. I don't have to drink. I don't have to drink. And I don't want to. And, Keith got out of the detox and we started going to our meetings. And we had our date night. I got a sponsor. Everybody in there that had a smile on their face had this thing called a sponsor. And they're really sweet until you ask them to sponsor you. And I'll tell you what, they weren't babysitting jobs back in 1976. They told you what to do. And they'd say, if you say, I don't want to do this, they say, then you're not ready for recovery yet. Go out and we promise, we guarantee your misery will come back. Thank God for that kind of sponsorship, because that's exactly what I needed. And so Keith got out of the detox, and my sponsor had told me that I had to collect 8 hugs at every meeting. Oh my gosh, I hated that. And so finally I told her, I said, you know what? I'm comfortable here now. I don't mind getting hugs anymore, but I don't do this at home. I don't feel this way at home. And she said, you know what? We don't care if you're wonderful every night for an hour, hour and a half in a meeting. You got sick at home, and that's where you're going to take this recovery. And so tonight you're going to go home, and you're going to hug Keith. And I said, I don't want it. And she goes, I don't care. And so I went home that night, and I kept saying the serenity prayer over and over, and I'd say, God, if this thing's works, it better work tonight. And so Keith came home, and he's walking toward me, and I put my arms around him and hugged him. He jerks back, and he goes, what's that for? And I said, they told me to do it. Don't ask me why. And that's the way we start our recovery. And it started getting better little by little, you know. I could walk by Keith and pat him on the shoulder, and he got where he wouldn't flinch anymore, you know. And he wasn't yelling at me like he used to yell at me, you know. And, you know, we'd walk away. When something would happen, we'd just walk away, and I'd go call my sponsor. We start ragging on each other. Call your sponsor, you know, the 3 magic words. And we started doing that in our home, even with Simone. Simone did not want to go to Alateen. She'd drink mustard water and stuff before her Alateen meeting, and she'd say, I don't want to go, I'm sick. I hear about sex, drugs, and rock and roll in those meetings, and we'd say, what do you hear there that's worse than what have you heard in your own home? And we'd hand her a coffee can, an empty coffee can, and say, here, go throw out in your meeting. And we all got through the newcomer stuff. Thank God. And we started working a program, and Keith and I gradually, you know, he was, like I said earlier, he embarrassed me a lot. He's funny, but when I was new in Al-Anon, before I got to Al-Anon, it was an embarrassment, because what did they think, you know? And I remember one night this AA couple had invited us over for dinner, and there was another AA couple there when we got there, and I was the only Al-Anon there. And they were fixing dinner, and Keith had talked about Las Vegas. A few weeks before, he had gone with his sponsor to Las Vegas, and I got mad about that. But he came home and told me that it was one of the good things that had happened to him, because on his way home, he got to give his fifth step to his sponsor. See, the things that I think are bad are not right, you know. Good things come out of what I think's bad. And so he had been able to do that with his sponsor, and so it wasn't a bad deal, you know. And I'd had to really work a program through that. And so that night he got, when we was at these people's house, he started telling them about Las Vegas. And so this lady, she started turning the fire off under her pots, and she started putting stuff in the refrigerator, and I go, whoa, wait a minute, what are you doing? She said, well, didn't you hear him talking about Las Vegas? We're going to Las Vegas tonight. And I go, it's Saturday night. She said, yeah, we'll be back by 6 o'clock in the morning. And I'm going, you know, Al-Anons are not spontaneous at all. You got to plan forever. And I go, okay, I'm not going to be left out this time. And so I called Simone, and she'd stayed over at Becky's house. And I called her, and I said, Simone, your dad's going nuts again, and I'm going with him this time. And we got in the car, and us 3 ladies were sitting in the back seat, and Keith was sitting in the front seat between these 2 guys. And they were laughing and yucking it up, and one of the ladies looked at me and said, your husband is so funny. Now, I remember a time when a lady told me something about my husband, and she'd been flirting with him, and I threw her through a plate glass window at the VFW building. And so this lady's telling me this about Keith, and I looked at her and I said, you know what? You're right. He is funny. And that's the minute that I accepted that my husband was a funny man, and if anybody was going to enjoy him, it was going to be me. Yeah. I used to go to the AA speaker meetings with him, and I'd hear the AA women talking about you, and I could always tell the Al-Anons they're the dowdy ones. And I'd say, not me. You know, and I'd get all dressed up to go to those AA speaker meetings. And these women would come up, and they'd hug Keith and give him a kiss. And I couldn't get mad because they're alcoholics. There weren't women in there hitting on him. They were alcoholics. And I thought, if they're going to hug and kiss him, they're going to hug and kiss me. They're going to be my friends, too. And so when they'd hug and kiss Keith, I'd say, hi, I'm Sue. I'm Keith's wife. Can I have a hug? Oh, my God. I made some of the neatest relationships with AA women in my life. There was one international we went to. The AA women, they loved me, too, because I don't know why. But they said, we was at the international, and they asked Keith, can we take Sue out for dinner? And I said, I'm not going to go to dinner with you guys. I'm going to go with Keith and the people we're with. Why? And they said, because we want you to have one more glass of wine so we can stand you up at the international convention as our newcomer. They said, you're only one drink away, baby. But the truth is that I love this program. I wanted to work a program like I saw alcoholics working a program. I didn't want to go to the meetings where the wives were dumping about their husbands, where they were taking their husband's inventory and they were getting sicker in Al-Anon. And I didn't want to be like that. And this one lady bragged in a meeting that she told her husband he couldn't go to any AA meetings anymore unless they were men's stags, because she didn't want him to be around those AA women. And I love those AA women. They're sick. They have a disease called alcoholism. You know, they're trying to do better, just like my husband is. And I want to be supportive of their program too. And I developed a lot of loving relationships like that. And so I started an Al-Anon step study in Orange County, California. It was the first one that was ever in California, because I wanted to work these steps. And I wanted to be in meetings where people thought of that. And so I did, you know, and eventually I was asked to do a panel in a woman's prison. And I've been asking about it for a long time, and people would say, why do you want to go to prison? And I'd say, well, because I know there's women in there just like me. And I ended up going on a panel, and these women said, you know, these inmates, they like you. They don't understand us. And I can't do this anymore, so you need to take over this panel. We had a lockdown in there one night, and they had a no hostage policy. And a couple of gals that I'd taken with me said, oh, whoa, Sue, you know, because they locked the doors and nobody gets out. And they said, what are we going to do? And this one gal said, well, Sue has a strong God, you know, we'll borrow hers. And I said, no, we're not. So he's working for me tonight. And he said, what if they take us hostage? I said, love the one you're with. So it's just, and next Thursday night, Keith and I are going to be in that prison. And they ask us to come to their banquet every year. It's the first Al-Anon that they ever asked to go to their volunteers banquet in that prison. And all the inmates are in there. And Keith and I have had our panel. He has a panel in there too. And those women literally loved him back into understanding women. Keith was a woman hater when he got to this program, and those inmates literally loved him back. And I'm so grateful to them. And so we've had a panel in there for 30 years, and we've never had a dark night in there. And then we were able to, a few years ago, get a house in Las Vegas. And so we go back and forth between Las Vegas, and Al-Anon was very disappointing to me in Las Vegas because they seemed like all of the meetings were dump meetings. One of the meetings were using the book Women Who Love Too Much, and I about died. And I called my sponsor and reported him. And she said I wasn't the Al-Anon police. And so there was a lot of acceptance on my part. And it just, I remember sitting in a meeting one night, and I sat there, and these ladies were dumping, or everybody was, and I just go, God, I can't do this. I'm going to get sicker here. You know, if I'm going to be here and I'm going to go to Al-Anon, you got to do something. You got to help me. You know, you got to help these people. This is an Al-Anon. And I remembered one time when Keith and I were sharing at a conference in Amarillo, Texas. I was with a long-timer, and I was really close to her, Arbutus O'Neill. Yeah. Loved her very, very much. And her and I went into an Al-Anon meeting, and people were dumping in that meeting. I didn't know that at that time, but she did. And she shot straight up in that meeting, and she stood there, and she goes, Al-Anon is not a garbage can. You share that stuff with your sponsors, and you write about it, and you give it to your sponsor. Then you come to meetings, and you share what you went through, and you share what you did to get into the solution, and then you share what the solution is. And that's Al-Anon. And this is not a garbage can. So if you're going to go to Al-Anon, you need to make it Al-Anon. And I'm sitting in my meeting, and I remember that. And I'm going, oh, God, I can't do that. And so I listened to a few more ladies dump their stuff, and it comes back to me. And I go, okay, God, but please let me be nice. And so when it came my turn to share, I said, you know what, I've been coming to this meeting. Nobody comes in here with anything but a bunch of garbage. You dump in this meeting, and I guess you just pick it up and take it home with you because you come back next week and you update everybody on your latest deal. And I said, you're getting sicker in Al-Anon's than you are in recovery. And I said, I've been in this deal long enough to know what Al-Anon is and to know what Al-Anon is not. And this is not Al-Anon. And if you want to get better, you're going to read your literature, you're going to pray to a God that you understand, or until you do understand him, you need to get a sponsor. I don't know if you'd know a step if you tripped over it. And I said, I don't care if I pissed you off, but now you know what Al-Anon is. And I explained to him how Arbutus had explained in that meeting. And then I just went, whew. Because you know when you feel like you're just going to blow up? And I was nice. I said it really calmly. And some of the women came up to me afterwards and said, oh my gosh, you're so right. Thank you so much, you know. And it's like the next week I thought, oh, whoa, I got to go back to that meeting if I'm going to do that. And I went back to that meeting. This little gal leading the meeting said, you know what, I heard what Sue said last week, and tonight we're gonna discuss what was in the One Day at a Time page today. And I went, thank God, thank God. You know, I don't have to do any of this kind of stuff. Nobody has to. None of these people have to be on this committee. Nobody has to do anything. Just go to meetings and sit on our butts. That's what we got to do. But that's not recovery. I believe that God gave us an opportunity to find the answer. I believe that God put an alcoholic in my life so I could find you, so I could find my God, and so I could carry a message. He gave me a job to do. I'm here to be of service to my God. I go to every meeting to be of service to my God. I was involved in service many years and still am. And I believe that all of us have the obligation, and we need to pay our God back for giving us a second chance of life by carrying a message of recovery and not whining in our meetings. Have a sponsor and go through the steps and share with people, newcomers. God, I was 2 years in the program, and I wanted to sponsor somebody so bad, and I went to a AA meeting with my sponsor, and I saved a seat for this newcomer, and I told her I was going there, and she needed to come to an AA speaker meeting so she'd understand alcoholics better. And so I see her come in, and she comes in, and I motion her over, and I said, this seat's for you. I saved this seat for you. And she goes, I'm not going to sit there. I said, why not? And she said, I don't like you. I was overwhelmed. I thought we all got here and everybody liked everybody. But I learned a lot that night. It's not about me. It's about change. And if I don't change, I won't be a program of attraction. I had to turn anger into love. I had to turn greediness into giving. And I can turn the stubbornness into an asset in my life because I refuse to go through this disease twice. That's why our daughter went to Alateen. And she grew up, she went to Al-Anon, and she followed her dream. She became a model, and she wanted to go to Milan, Italy, and she went to Milan, Italy, and she became a very good model, very successful model. And she met an Italian man over there. He's a very nice-looking man. He's very Italian. He doesn't drink or use. He loves to make money, and we're happy for that. And he's from a very traditional family. And if she was sitting here today, she would talk to you about Al-Anon and AA in Milan, Italy. She's been very instrumental. The program was very young when she got there. They hardly had any literature, and she's been very instrumental in helping translate AA and Al-Anon literature into Italian language. She called me one day after Lois Remembers' book comes out. And remember, in Lois Remembers, it talks about how they're in that motorcycle with the sidecar, and Lois is driving, and Bill's in the sidecar, and they drive up to this farmhouse to see if they have any food or if they can have a night stay there. And this little boy standing out on the porch says, "What do you wops want?" And it's in the book. It's in Lois Remembers. And Simone called me, and she said, "Mom, I'm trying to translate this into Italian. What's a wop?" I said, well, Simone, maybe we should change that to what do you folks need? And we was laying in bed one night, and Simone was in her car with this one lady, and her husband was in the car, and he wanted some answers, and she called her dad. And she asked Keith to talk to this guy. Can you help 12-step this guy? And he said, I can't speak Italian. She goes, I can. And so her dad talked to her, and she'd translate it to the man in that car. What a God thing, huh? Yeah, we have 2 grandkids, and we love them to death, and they're good kids. They're good kids. The eldest one's very strong-willed, and she's 14. She's built like me. She got so, a year ago, she was just down on herself so much because she was big-chested, and she thought it was bad. And Simone called and told us how she was developing, and she was very embarrassed by it. And I said, put her on the phone. So Nicole gets on the phone, and I said, so you have a big chest, huh? She said, oh, bad, Granny, bad. And I said, no, that's the part you got from Granny. You stand up, and you put your shoulders back, and you walk with pride because, baby, we were born this way. And, okay, Granny. And a few nights later, they were in a restaurant, and Fabio, her dad, had said something, a chesty lady had come in, and Nicole said, no, Daddy, she was born that way. God gave her that way. And so these kids, they love their life. They go to this Catholic school, and it's good for them. And we just have forgiveness that never would, and we didn't work on our families. That's the thing about recovery, is that we can't fix our families. We can only do what we got to do in our own programs and be in a program of attraction. God has not let any of the 3 of us, Keith, me, or Simone, be in a bad place at the same time. Isn't that a blessing? There's always one in the 3 of us that said, God loves you, and have you talked to your sponsor? Have you written about this? Because our family believes in writing. And we write it, and we look at the 4th column, and we call our sponsor, and we get through it, and we move on. ALANONs, they say, we go down with claw marks. We can't let anything loose. And move on is so important, to work through those things, write about it, give it away, and move on. This is a program of recovery. It's not a program of whining. And Keith shared this morning with you that he goes to NA meetings, and I went to a NA meeting with him in Las Vegas a few weeks ago, and there was this lady in there in a wheelchair, and she raised her hand as a newcomer. And I thought, wow, I wonder what she did in a wheelchair as a newcomer. And so they asked her if she had anything to say, and she said, yeah. And she was there by order of the court because she had gotten a DUI going down Las Vegas Boulevard in her wheelchair. And it's like everybody was helping her after the meeting, and I went over and gave her a big hug, This is a great way of life. I have it, you have it. What are we going to do with it? Let's go out and give it away. That's what God wants us to do. We have a new employer, and his name's called God. He wants us to stay in recovery. And the young people over there, get busy, 12-step work. God, there's a lot of young people out there dying. I have... One of the ladies I sponsor called us yesterday, and her 30-year-old son that's been sober for 11 years had to have heart surgery because he's damaged his heart so bad when he was out there. And it doesn't matter how long you do it. You run it hard and fast, and it kills physically, but it hurts the people around you to watch you do it. And today we don't help each other, we help ourselves, and we be attraction to each other, and we just love each other. And this is a program of love and change. And thank you all very much for inviting us to be here.